Doctor dismissed a patient's pain until a shocking truth revealed who he really was. Dr. Rachel Whitman adjusted her white coat, mentally preparing for the day ahead. Her morning had been nothing short of chaotic, rushing through traffic, spilling coffee, and forgetting her favorite pen. But as she entered the exam room to meet her next patient, she pushed it all aside, ready to tackle the case. Sitting on the exam table was a tall man, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, yet visibly uncomfortable. He had a calm but intense presence, and Rachel couldn't help but notice the contrast between his formal attire and a nervous tension in his shoulders. She glanced down at her clipboard, skimming over his details. Dr. Kwame Hayes, 42, presenting with recurring migraines. Rachel felt an odd twinge. There was no rational reason, but she dismissed it as the subtle discomfort that often emerged in unfamiliar situations. She offered a professional smile and extended her hand, which he shook politely but briefly. "So, Dr. Hayes," she began, her tone clipped, "tell me about these migraines. How long have you been experiencing them?" Dr. Hayes started to explain, detailing the symptoms and their impact on his life. He spoke with clarity and precision, his voice strong yet tinged with a hint of vulnerability as he described the relentless pain. But Rachel found herself only half listening, skimming over his words with an implicit skepticism she couldn't quite justify. "Have you tried over-the-counter painkillers?" she interrupted, barely looking up from her notes. Dr. Hayes' expression shifted, a slight frown creasing his forehead. "Yes," he replied evenly, though his eyes hinted at surprise. "I've tried everything." As he continued, Rachel sensed a growing unease in his gaze, one that mirrored the rising discomfort in her chest, though she couldn't yet place why. Dr. Hayes took a deep breath, visibly holding back frustration as Dr. Whitman continued her questioning. Each time she dismissed his responses with a cursory nod or an automated suggestion, his patience thinned. Finally, he placed his hands on the edge of the exam table, his expression hardening. "Dr. Whitman," he interrupted, his voice firm, "I didn't come here to be told to take more aspirin. I'm well aware of the basics. I've been dealing with this for months, and it's affecting my work." Rachel blinked, caught off guard by his tone. She met his gaze, feeling a rush of defensiveness surge through her. "I understand your frustration, but I see a lot of patients who come in without trying the basics first. I'm just covering all the possibilities." Dr. Hayes' eyes narrowed, his lips pressing into a thin line. He leaned forward slightly, his voice now edged with steel. "I'm not one of those patients. I am a surgeon, a neurosurgeon. I understand my symptoms better than most." Rachel's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Her mind reeled, struggling to reconcile the man before her with her initial assumptions. She forced a tight smile, hoping to regain control of the conversation. "I see. But even as a neurosurgeon, it's best to rule out." He cut her off, his patience clearly frayed. "Let's not play games here, Dr. Whitman. I know when I'm not being taken seriously. I've been through this before, but I had expected better from someone in your position." The words hit Rachel like a slap, and she stiffened, her defenses rising higher. She was used to difficult patients, but something about this exchange cut deeper than usual. She fumbled for a response, but the moment stretched awkwardly, the air between them thick with unspoken tensions. Dr. Hayes shook his head, his expression a mixture of resignation and something else, disappointment. "Thank you for your time, doctor," he said curtly, standing up from the table. "I'll be seeking a second opinion." Rachel watched him walk out of the room, the door closing behind him with a sharp click, leaving her with a discomfort she couldn't shake. As Rachel sat alone in the now empty exam room, the tension of the encounter slowly dissipated, leaving behind a gnawing sense of discomfort. She replayed Dr. Hayes' words in her mind, his frustration clear, his authority undeniable. How had she missed the signs? She forced herself to look at his chart again, more carefully this time. Dr. Kwame Hayes, Chief of Neurosurgery, Johns Hopkins University. The words hit her like a punch, sending a rush of humiliation through her. This wasn't just a skilled surgeon. He was a leader in their field, someone she should have admired and respected from the start. Her fingers tightened around the clipboard, a mixture of regret and self-reproach rising in her chest. She'd been quick to assume, to categorize him as just another patient complaining of headaches without any real insight into his own health. But this was a world-renowned neurosurgeon, someone who knew the intricacies of the brain far better than she did. How could she have been so dismissive? Sitting there in silence, Rachel felt the weight of her bias pressing down on her, uncomfortable and undeniable. She couldn't ignore the small, unpleasant truth she'd just uncovered. She had looked at Dr. Hayes and, without realizing it, had made judgments. She'd minimized his pain and questioned his authority in a way she likely wouldn't have with another patient. Her stomach tightened with shame, but behind that, there was also a ripple of fear. If this was how she'd treated someone of his stature, how many others had suffered from her unconscious biases? It was a question she couldn't answer, but knew she'd need to face. For the first time in her career, Dr. Rachel Whitman felt profoundly unsettled, haunted by the knowledge that perhaps her own prejudices ran deeper than she'd ever been willing to admit. As Dr. Kwame Hayes left the hospital, his mind replayed the encounter with Dr. Whitman, the quiet sting of her assumptions still raw. He'd felt this sting before, many times in fact, in small, cutting moments that he'd learned to brush off. But even now, years into a successful career, it still amazed him how easily people could overlook his experience, his expertise, even his humanity. He remembered his first days in medical school, the whispers in the hallways, the professors who would subtly question his knowledge more than his peers. Even as he excelled, pushing past the expectations others placed on him, there was always a new hurdle, a new doubt cast by someone who couldn't quite see him as an equal. Growing up, Kwame's journey into medicine hadn't been typical. Raised in a bustling neighborhood in Chicago, he'd watched friends succumb to gang violence, lack of resources, and a healthcare system that often seemed indifferent to their struggles. But he'd been determined, focusing relentlessly on his studies, even as others questioned his path. The community supported him, cheering him on as he earned scholarships and eventually his place at a prestigious medical school. The hardships only intensified as he entered the competitive field of neurosurgery, where his every step was scrutinized, his every mistake amplified. But with each barrier, he became more resilient, carving a space for himself in a world that had never made room for someone like him. He built a reputation that transcended titles, a reputation of dedication and brilliance. And yet, here he was, facing the same quiet disregard in a simple exam room. As he walked through the hospital corridors, he found his resolve strengthening, a familiar fire igniting within him. He wouldn't let Dr. Whitman's biases define him, nor would he let her dismissive attitude linger in his mind. He'd spent too long rising above prejudice to let this shake him. And yet, a part of him couldn't help but wonder, would his presence here, his very existence in this space, ever truly be enough? The next day, Dr. Whitman found herself rehearsing what she'd say to Dr. Hayes as she made her way to his office. She'd thought about the encounter all night, turning it over in her mind, wondering what she could have done differently and how she'd managed to let her assumptions get the best of her. She knew she owed him an apology, but as she stood outside his office door, her confidence wavered. Taking a deep breath, she knocked, and after a moment, Dr. Hayes called for her to enter. He looked up, surprise flickering across his face as she walked in, but he maintained a cool, professional demeanor. "Dr. Hayes," she began, her voice softer than usual, "I wanted to talk to you about yesterday." He raised an eyebrow, his gaze steady but guarded. "Yes," she swallowed, feeling the weight of his gaze. "I wanted to apologize for how I approached our appointment. I realize now that I didn't give you the respect you deserve, and I'm truly sorry." Dr. Hayes' face remained unreadable, and he simply nodded. "Thank you, Dr. Whitman. I appreciate you taking the time to say that." His tone was polite but distant, and she could tell her words hadn't bridged the gap she'd hoped they might. An uncomfortable silence settled between them, and she searched for something more to say, something that might make him understand her sincerity. But before she could find the words, Dr. Hayes straightened, his expression firm. "With all due respect, Dr. Whitman, an apology doesn't erase assumptions. I've learned to deal with these moments, but that doesn't make them any less disappointing." His voice was steady, yet there was a vulnerability in his eyes, a flicker of exhaustion from years of facing the same battle. Rachel felt a pang of guilt and frustration as he held her gaze for a beat longer, then politely dismissed her with a nod. She left his office feeling emptier than before, realizing that some wounds ran too deep to be healed with a single apology. Rachel sat in the dimly lit break room, stirring a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Her mind drifted back to her interaction with Dr. Hayes, replaying each word, each expression. She'd thought a simple apology would be enough, a professional olive branch to mend the tension. But instead, she had walked away feeling even more hollow, as though her apology had done nothing but underline the gap between them. It wasn't the first time she'd heard about implicit bias. She'd attended seminars, skimmed articles, and checked the necessary boxes for workplace training. But she'd never really considered the depth of the issue, or that she might be part of the problem. After all, she'd always seen herself as fair and professional, dedicated to her work and her patients. Yet, as she sat there, she realized how easily she'd allowed assumptions to shape her behavior. It hadn't been conscious or malicious, just a quiet voice in her mind, quick to judge, quick to dismiss. The truth was uncomfortable, but undeniable. Rachel pulled out her phone, searching for articles on healthcare bias. As she skimmed through studies and statistics, her heart sank. Black patients were, on average, prescribed less pain medication, given fewer diagnostic tests, and often treated with suspicion instead of compassion. She had always read these statistics in a detached way, as if they were problems outside of her world. But now she couldn't shake the thought. Had she, in some small way, contributed to these numbers? The coffee tasted bitter on her tongue, mirroring the self-awareness settling in her chest. She knew this wasn't something she could fix overnight, nor would a single apology to Dr. Hayes be enough. But she also understood that if she was going to call herself a true doctor, it was time to confront these biases head-on. For the first time in her career, Rachel felt herself on the brink of real change. Rachel couldn't shake the thoughts that had gripped her since her apology to Dr. Hayes. Over the following days, she became almost obsessive, spending hours poring over articles, studies, and first-hand accounts from patients who had experienced bias in healthcare. The statistics were staggering, but it was the personal stories that hit hardest. She found stories from patients who had been ignored, dismissed, or given subpar treatment simply because of their race. For the first time, she truly understood the weight of this reality, and it left her feeling both horrified and driven. In the quiet of her office, she stumbled across a comprehensive study detailing the outcomes for Black patients compared to their white counterparts. The numbers were sobering, and each one felt like a heavy blow. For every 10 patients with symptoms similar to Dr. Hayes, Black patients were less likely to receive specialized tests and more likely to be sent home without a clear diagnosis. Rachel's chest tightened as she recognized how easily Dr. Hayes could have been one of those statistics. It wasn't enough to be vaguely aware of these issues, she realized. If she was to be part of the solution, she'd need to actively work against the subtle biases she'd carried for so long. Her mind raced with questions. How many other patients had she treated dismissively, all without realizing it? How often had her assumptions clouded her clinical judgment? Determined, she began jotting down ideas. She could push for more rigorous training on implicit bias within her department, or perhaps organize workshops with specialists who understood the intersection of race and healthcare. She'd start with herself, challenging her own thinking, but she knew this change had to reach beyond her individual actions. By the time the sun set, Rachel was exhausted, yet oddly exhilarated. For the first time, she felt as though she was finally seeing the world, in her own practice, with clarity. She didn't know how Dr. Hayes would react if he knew the steps she was taking, but she hoped that, one day, he might see her as someone who had truly learned from her mistakes. A week later, Rachel was informed of an upcoming high-stakes surgery that would require the combined expertise of several departments. To her surprise and discomfort, Dr. Hayes was assigned as the lead surgeon. Rachel's role would be to assist with preoperative planning and oversee the patient's recovery. The collaboration was unavoidable, and the irony wasn't lost on her. The very man she dismissed was now her partner on one of the most critical cases of her career. When she arrived at the conference room, Dr. Hayes was already there, reviewing scans and talking with a team of residents. He acknowledged her with a slight nod, his expression neutral. She felt the familiar surge of embarrassment, but forced herself to push past it. This wasn't about her. It was about the patient, and she was determined to prove herself worthy of the role, especially with Dr. Hayes watching. As the meeting commenced, Rachel was struck by Dr. Hayes' precision and calm under pressure. He broke down each step of the surgery with an effortless confidence that captivated everyone in the room. His knowledge was undeniable, and his attention to detail unparalleled. She found herself admiring his approach, humbled to be working alongside someone of his caliber. When the discussion turned to postoperative care, Rachel tentatively offered a suggestion regarding a possible complication. Dr. Hayes paused, considering her input carefully before nodding. Good point, Dr. Whitman. We'll prepare for that scenario. The simple acknowledgement felt like a victory, and she allowed herself a small sigh of relief. Over the next few hours, they reviewed every detail, discussing strategies and possible complications. Slowly, Rachel sensed a thawing of the tension between them, though neither of them acknowledged it outright. They were professionals, and for now, that was enough. As the meeting wrapped up, Rachel felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps this collaboration would be a step toward earning his respect and redeeming herself in her own eyes. The day of the surgery arrived with a mix of tension and anticipation. Rachel stood in the OR, her nerves buzzing as she prepared alongside Dr. Hayes. The patient's case was complex, an aggressive brain tumor pressing on critical nerve pathways, and every step had to be executed with precision. She'd never assisted on such a delicate procedure before, and the stakes weighed heavily on her. As the surgery began, Rachel was struck by the grace and precision with which Dr. Hayes operated. His hands moved steadily, guided by years of experience and an almost intuitive understanding of the human brain. He barely spoke, except for the occasional command to his team, but his calm focus radiated through the room, creating an atmosphere of quiet confidence. At one critical juncture, Dr. Hayes encountered unexpected bleeding near a vital nerve. Rachel felt her breath catch, but Dr. Hayes remained unfazed, assessing the situation with a cool, clinical gaze. He spoke quietly, instructing her to assist with suction while he controlled the bleeding. She followed his guidance without hesitation, her own hands steady, bolstered by his assurance. Time seemed to blur as they worked in tandem, each step executed with an unspoken understanding. In that moment, Rachel forgot about the discomfort of their past interactions, feeling only a profound respect for the skill and dedication that Dr. Hayes brought to his work. When they finally completed the surgery, the patient stable and breathing on their own, Rachel felt a rush of relief and pride. She glanced over at Dr. Hayes, and for the first time, he met her gaze directly, a hint of respect softening his otherwise stoic expression. "Well done, Dr. Whitman," he said quietly. The simple words meant more to her than she'd anticipated, and as they left the OR, she felt the tentative beginnings of a newfound respect between them. The post-surgery hours were a blur of monitoring, debriefing, and follow-up assessments. Exhausted yet invigorated by the successful operation, Rachel found herself lingering in the recovery room, watching as the patient slowly regained consciousness. She didn't notice Dr. Hayes' approach until he spoke softly beside her. "They're responding well," he said, nodding toward the patient. His tone was calm, but there was a softness she hadn't heard from him before. "Yes, it's a relief to see," she replied, trying to match his composure. The silence stretched between them, weighted by all that had gone unsaid over the past weeks. To her surprise, Dr. Hayes was the one to break it. "You did well today, Dr. Whitman. I noticed the way you handled the complications. Not every doctor would have stayed as focused." Rachel turned to him, caught off guard by the sincerity in his voice. "Thank you, Dr. Hayes. That means a lot coming from you." She hesitated, then added, "I've learned a lot from watching you. Your approach, it's remarkable." He gave a slight nod, acknowledging the compliment, but steering clear of pride. This isn't an easy field. Neurosurgery demands every ounce of patience and precision, and it doesn't forgive mistakes. But it's moments like these that remind us why we do it. They both looked back at the patient, watching as their breathing steadied, a sign of a successful outcome. Rachel felt a newfound warmth in Dr. Hayes' presence, the former tension replaced with mutual respect. She sensed a rare openness in him, one she hadn't seen before. "Dr. Hayes," she ventured, feeling emboldened, "I know I misjudged you before, and I've been working to understand and correct those biases. I realize now just how much I still have to learn, not only in medicine, but about what it means to truly see people." He listened, his gaze thoughtful. "Awareness is the first step, Dr. Whitman, and from what I've seen, you're committed to more than just awareness." The words felt like a bridge between them, a tentative beginning of understanding. They stood there for a moment longer, united not just as colleagues, but as people who had confronted their own limitations and found, in each other, a path forward. A week later, the hospital was plunged into a flurry of chaos. An emergency had come in, a young patient with a severe brain hemorrhage requiring immediate surgery. Every second counted, and the complexity of the case demanded the hospital's best. Dr. Hayes was called in, and Rachel was tasked with assisting once again. As they scrubbed in, the urgency of the situation left no room for hesitation. Dr. Hayes quickly mapped out the procedure, his instructions crisp and efficient. Rachel felt a familiar nervous energy, but took comfort in the steadiness of his voice. This time, she didn't feel overshadowed. She felt empowered, knowing she was a crucial part of this life-saving effort. The surgery was intense. Each step required exacting precision, each movement choreographed to keep the hemorrhage under control. When Dr. Hayes encountered a clot dangerously close to the patient's brain stem, he signaled Rachel to assist him with a delicate maneuver. "Steady, Dr. Whitman," he said, his tone calm but insistent. Rachel's hands moved with the confidence she'd cultivated over years of training. But this time, it was heightened by the trust he placed in her. Together, they worked to control the bleeding, their movements synchronized, their focus absolute. For a brief moment, the room's bustle faded away, leaving only the two of them in silent partnership, pushing the boundaries of what they could accomplish as a team. After what felt like hours, the critical stage passed. Dr. Hayes sighed, a barely audible sound of relief, and Rachel allowed herself a small exhale. The patient was stable. As they finished, he looked at her, his expression more open than she'd ever seen. "I couldn't have done this without you," he admitted quietly. The words struck her deeply, more so than any praise she'd received before. In that moment, she felt the final walls between them dissolve. This wasn't just respect. They had saved a life together, each one relying on the other's expertise. As they exited the OR, Rachel understood something profound. This moment wasn't just about professional success. It was a shared experience that would anchor her commitment to becoming a better doctor and a better person. In Dr. Hayes, she saw not only a mentor, but an equal, and it gave her the courage to continue breaking down the biases that had once held her back. In the days following the intense surgery, Dr. Whitman found herself reflecting on how much had shifted between her and Dr. Hayes. Their shared experience in the OR had forged an unspoken bond, one that extended beyond professional respect. She felt a newfound sense of clarity, a conviction that this partnership could be a force for change, not just in their work, but in the hospital itself. A few days later, she caught Dr. Hayes in the hallway. He was between rounds, reading a chart with his usual intensity, but he looked up and gave her a brief nod as she approached. "Dr. Hayes, do you have a moment?" she asked, her tone slightly hesitant. He nodded, his expression encouraging her to continue. "Of course. What's on your mind?" She took a breath, the weight of her thoughts pressing on her. "After our recent cases together, I've been thinking about ways we could improve care for all our patients, not just in terms of surgical outcomes, but in addressing the implicit biases that affect how they're treated." Dr. Hayes regarded her thoughtfully. "I've been hoping you'd bring this up. Actually, this hospital could benefit from a more structured approach to addressing these issues, and it would mean a lot to have someone with your commitment leading the charge." His words filled her with a renewed sense of purpose. "What if we developed a program together?" she proposed. "Training sessions for the staff on implicit bias, as well as workshops where doctors can discuss experiences and learn from one another. We could even invite guest speakers, experts who specialize in healthcare equity. Dr. Hayes' face softened with approval. I think that would be an excellent start. It would give people a chance to examine their own perspectives and understand how they might affect patient care. More importantly, it would set a precedent, showing that this isn't just an isolated initiative, but a necessary part of our profession. Their ideas flowed easily, building upon each other's suggestions with a newfound synergy. By the end of the conversation, they'd mapped out the framework of a plan, both feeling a deep satisfaction in their shared vision. As they parted ways, Rachel felt a surge of gratitude. Not only had she found a way to make amends for her mistakes, but she was also creating something that could help countless others. In Dr. Hayes, she had found not just a colleague, but an ally, and together, they were on the path to making a lasting difference. Several weeks into the new bias training program, Dr. Whitman and Dr. Hayes were invited to a prestigious medical conference to present their initiative on healthcare equity. The event drew hundreds of top medical professionals from around the country, all eager to share the latest advancements in patient care and health equity. Rachel was both excited and nervous. This would be her first time publicly discussing their program, and she was determined to represent their work well. The day of the presentation, she and Dr. Hayes arrived at the conference center early. The grand hall was packed with attendees, and Rachel felt a familiar thrill mixed with anticipation. She was no stranger to speaking engagements, but this one carried a deeper significance. This was about much more than her own reputation. This was a chance to share something that could change lives. As she moved through the crowd, Rachel couldn't help but notice a few side glances and hesitant greetings. Many of the attendees seemed surprised to see her next to Dr. Hayes, who was well known and respected in these circles. During a brief coffee break, one of the senior doctors pulled her aside, his tone friendly yet condescending. "So, Dr. Whitman, are you here as Dr. Hayes' assistant today?" he asked with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Rachel felt a flash of irritation, but before she could respond, Dr. Hayes stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Actually, Dr. Whitman is co-leading this initiative. Her insights and dedication are what made this program a success. We're here as equals." The senior doctor's expression shifted, an embarrassed flush creeping up his face. He stammered an apology, then quickly excused himself. Rachel looked at Dr. Hayes, gratitude and respect shining in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly, touched by his unhesitating support. He gave her a small smile. "We're in this together, Dr. Whitman. Remember that." Their presentation went smoothly, the audience captivated by their stories and their vision for a more inclusive, empathetic healthcare system. Rachel spoke with newfound confidence, knowing she had an ally beside her. For the first time, she felt she truly belonged, not as a subordinate, but as a force for change. As the applause faded and the conference attendees dispersed, Rachel and Dr. Hayes lingered by the stage, absorbing the impact of their presentation. Several colleagues approached to express admiration for their work, each one reinforcing the importance of addressing biases in healthcare. The response had exceeded her expectations, and she felt a surge of pride, not just in the program, but in the team she and Dr. Hayes had become. After the session, they sat together in a quiet corner of the conference lounge, sharing a rare moment of rest. Rachel looked over at Dr. Hayes, her mind drifting back to the countless small acts of support he'd shown her. In him, she had found a mentor, an ally, and, perhaps most surprisingly, a friend. "Dr. Hayes," she began, her voice thoughtful, "I don't think I ever really understood what allyship looked like until now. You've been someone I can truly count on." She hesitated, searching for the right words. "You didn't have to stand up for me back there, but you did. It meant a lot." He looked at her, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "We all need someone who sees us for who we are, Rachel. It's not just about being a good doctor. It's about supporting each other in ways that matter." He paused, his gaze steady. "An allyship goes both ways. I can see that you're committed to making real change, and I'm proud to be part of that journey with you." His words warmed her, giving her a sense of validation she hadn't realized she'd been seeking. She nodded, absorbing the depth of his statement. Allyship wasn't simply about standing beside each other when it was convenient. It was about actively choosing to uplift and empower one another, even in the face of prejudice and discomfort. As they sat in companionable silence, Rachel felt a shift within herself, a new resolve to continue the work they'd started. Together, they'd made strides that neither of them could have achieved alone, and she knew that this was just the beginning. Dr. Hayes glanced at his watch, breaking the silence. Ready to get back? We have a lot of work ahead of us. His tone was light, but she could see the glint of determination in his eyes. More than ready, she replied, matching his enthusiasm. With renewed purpose, they left the lounge, walking side by side toward the future they were determined to shape together. Back at the hospital, Dr. Whitman and Dr. Hayes stood side by side in the conference room, addressing a crowd of staff members assembled for the first official training session on implicit bias and healthcare equity. Rachel could hardly believe how much had changed in such a short time. This moment, once a distant vision, was now a reality, and she felt a surge of pride in all they'd accomplished together. As she began her introduction, her eyes scanned the room, noting the mix of expressions: curiosity, enthusiasm, and perhaps a hint of skepticism. But that was okay. She remembered feeling those very same things when she'd first approached Dr. Hayes with her idea. Now, she was here to show her colleagues the same compassion and patience he'd shown her. Dr. Hayes took over seamlessly, speaking with his usual quiet authority. He shared personal stories from his own career, each one highlighting the subtle biases he'd faced and the resilience he'd had to cultivate. His words were raw, yet he presented them with a dignity that had always defined him. The room hung on his every word, captivated not just by his expertise, but by the vulnerability he allowed himself to share. Rachel could see that his openness resonated deeply with the audience, inspiring both admiration and reflection. She felt grateful to have a partner in this mission who could reach people in ways she couldn't. Together, their perspectives and experiences created a fuller, richer narrative. When the session ended, there was a ripple of applause, and several staff members approached them with thanks and questions, eager to learn more. Rachel felt the beginnings of a true cultural shift, a new chapter for the hospital in which empathy and equity would be at the forefront. As the last of the attendees filtered out, Dr. Hayes turned to her, a rare smile lighting up his face. "We did it, Dr. Whitman. I think we've really started something here." She returned his smile, feeling a warmth that came not only from their shared accomplishment, but from the personal growth this journey had brought her. "We did," she replied, "and this is only the beginning." They stood together in a moment of quiet satisfaction, knowing that their work was far from over, but feeling stronger for the journey they'd taken to get here. In each other, they'd found a partnership rooted not just in professional respect, but in a deep commitment to making the world a better place. One patient, one colleague, one conversation at a time. Together, they stepped forward, ready to embrace the new chapter they'd forged.